Well, thank you very much. I do intend to be outrageous today. When I was asked to do this, I wasn't quite sure what I was being asked to do, and I decided that under the circumstances, I should probably put forth the most outrageous presentation that I could. So I want to start by telling you what it is that I'm going to talk about, because otherwise you may get lost somewhere along the way. Some of you may get lost regardless. So I'm going to argue that many of the problems we've been talking about, starting this morning, and maybe before that, go back to 15th century artistic innovation. And that what happens here was an amplifying of the detailed features of the world, that even as it reduced our direct contacts with the phenomenal world. This has left us with a fractured division of knowledge, and the crises facing us, I want to argue, require reclaiming that phenomenal world and beginning to understand how we collectively create it. Okay. So, what I'm going to start is by talking about the art of seeing. And I'm going to talk about the inventions of two fellows, Alberti and Dürer, who helped us to see in a very different way. I'm then going to talk about how Descartes changed this, expanded on this, led to the Great Schism and its aftermath. Now, I'm not talking about the one in the Catholic Church, for those of you who are familiar with that one, but rather a schism in the way in which we understand knowledge. How liberalism and neoliberalism wound up getting involved in this. I'll then briefly talk about the crises that currently face us, which I think you all know, how that relates to universities. And then I want to talk about some concepts that might be useful for producing a more sustainable future. And finally, I want to propose the creation of a new meta-discipline. Okay? So this is probably a grossly overambitious talk. Well, I want to start with the medieval division of knowledge. Back in the Middle Ages, knowledge was divided into two parts. The trivium, that is to say, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. Now, the thing that strikes us when we look at this is how strange this sounds to us. This is the oddest way of dividing knowledge up for our contemporary modern ears and eyes that one could possibly imagine. And what I want to suggest is it's quite possible that our modern division of knowledge, which I'll get to later, may seem just as strange to people 50 or 100 years from now. So I want to start by talking about Leon Battista Alberti, who in 1435 wrote a book called De Pictura, which was then translated into Latin, the lingua franca of the period, in the 1440s. And he was the first person to theorize the idea of perspective. And in doing so, he completely revolutionized art. Now, I should just note here in passing that he wrote a textbook. De Pictura is a kind of text in which you actually had to sit down and study something that we today would see as simply obvious. His work was spread by Alberti and Dürer, who wrote this even more compendious text called The Course in the Art of Measurement with Compass and Ruler, and he spread Alberti's ideas all across Northern Europe. So by 1600, Alberti's ideas were commonplace. Now, what was this all about? It was that in order to produce a perspective drawing, you had to divide what you were doing into a series of geometric squares. And what this then allowed one to do was that the artist could paint just what was visible in a single square at one time. It didn't have to make any sense any more than that little dot, if I had just shown you that by itself, would make any sense. You just simply painted what you saw in that square. It also required a fixed gaze. Notice that this gadget that this fellow has, this obelisk, which he uses to make sure that his eye is always in the same place. And I should note just in passing, although I'm not going to develop this theme, that in every one of the pictures I've been able to find, it's almost invariably a male who is behind that fixed gaze and a female who's on the other side of the screen. What they did was to privilege sight over other senses, and they applied mathematics to art in a systematic way. They divided the world into small pieces in order to know it better. They also separated the world from the observer, who sees the world through a window. And they separated, of course, subjects from objects. Now, somewhat later, Descartes comes along. And Descartes, I would argue, building on this tradition, although not in any conscious way, to my knowledge he never cites these folks, says, I think, therefore I am. For Descartes, the world starts in here. It is the observer, the solitary observer, who records the world as it passes by. Moreover, and very importantly, he connects algebra to geometry, showing how a squared plus b squared equals c squared is not merely a geometric phenomenon, but is also an algebraic phenomenon. And I'll come back to why that's important. He proposes four rules of method. Avoid prejudice, that is to say, don't walk into a situation assuming you already know the answer. Divide things into as many parts as possible. Begin with the simplest, move to the more complex, and make complete enumerations. Now, the first three of these sound quite reasonable to us today. We've, of course, abandoned the fourth, replacing it by this thing called statistics. But the first three are basically the way in which much of the scholarly work that gets done today gets done. So we are the inheritors of a kind of knowledge that claim to be absolute, that claim to be singular, that claim to be detached, that claim to be expert. No need to involve publics because there's nothing to discuss. And this is exceptionally effective for problem-solving normal science. It's an incredibly effective set of tools. It allows one to go from the grid to the table to the map. Okay? All using the same kind of algebraic and geometric relationships. But then a great schism occurred. And that schism was the division of philosophy, first into natural and political philosophy, but ultimately into the natural sciences and the social sciences. And I want to assert it all starts with Alberti's grid. So let me briefly, and this is obviously got to be done briefly because we don't have 3 hours, or you don't have 3 hours to listen to me. You probably don't want to listen to me for 3 hours. Let me briefly talk about the natural sciences and this fellow Galileo, who probably most of you have heard of. Galileo adds to this collection of things the idea that we have primary qualities, those things which are independent of the observer, things like solidity, extension, and number. And then we have secondary qualities, which are related to the observer, things like color, taste, and sound. Galileo also tells us, and here I quote, "The universe is written in mathematical language, and the letters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures." Now, while Galileo is doing this, there's also things going on the social science side of things. And I specifically want to begin by emphasizing what Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and others did in inventing the idea of a social contract. Now, it's very important. Once you've come to the conclusion that the world is made up of individuals who are isolates, you have to figure out then how in the world society is possible. And the solution they came up with, starting with Hobbes, is the social contract. that society is a kind of coming together of individuals who agree to live no longer in a state of nature. And what's interesting about this idea is that the state of nature for these folks is simultaneously a kind of origin myth and a real state of things. So these folks are constantly pointing their fingers across the Atlantic and saying, oh, look at those Native Americans. They are living in a state of nature. Oh, but the state of nature, well, that's purely a fiction. And this tension is constantly out there as to what in the world this state of nature might be and how a social contract might be formed. And please don't misunderstand me. Obviously, these folks have very significant differences in the way in which they saw this social contract as coming to be. The next step in this transformation involves the creation of classical liberalism. And here I'll pick on Adam Smith, who believed, perhaps rightly, that people's sociality is at the root of conflict. Smith says people are clearly social animals. Clearly, we are very concerned about what our neighbors think of us. We act in ways that we are expected to act by our neighbors most of the time. But this, in fact, rouses the passions. This creates all sorts of problems. And so what he proposes is that market competition might be a way to make people act as if they were isolates. And Smith, in his classic work, The Wealth of Nations, goes on for several hundred pages complaining about corporations, trade unions, and professional associations. He even goes down so far as to talk about professional associations among, for example, university professors, and suggesting that the idea that they should actually do this is a really bad idea. And he suggests that, in fact, nation-states should discourage this kind of association because this creates all sorts of possibilities for intrigue, for plots, for capturing of markets, and for arousing of the passions. Moreover, for Smith, the market is a space to be carved out as free of state intervention. It's a place where monarchs are to fear to tread. And the argument is if we can just keep the state out of there, everything will be just fine. Now, neoclassical economics, of course, picks this up. It enshrines methodological individualism. It suggests that people are to be treated as autonomous individuals, and it adds this notion that the idea is one of maximizing utility. Right? It's not just that people are autonomous individuals, but they're utility maximizers. I remember many, many years ago taking a course with John Mellor, some of you probably know, and he talked about everyone having a personal utility preference surface. And several of us challenged him to show us just exactly in what part of the brain one could find their personal utility preference surface. Well, competition in the market then is seen as the best means to achieve social welfare, where social welfare is usually defined, not always, but usually defined in terms of this technical notion of Pareto optimality, the greatest good for the greatest number, but no one worse off than they were before. Now, I want to emphasize that all of this fits very nicely yet with Alberti's invention back there in the 1400s. And then a very odd thing happens in 1938. Walter Lippmann, well-known American journalist, writes a book called The Good Society. And it's a critique of what's going on in governments around the world and a proposal for how one might rethink it. And a French logician by the name of Louis Rougier is so taken by Lippmann's book that he says, by gosh, we should have a conference here in Paris, and at an invitational conference, we will invite a great number of the liberals in the world at that time, classical liberals in the world at that time, to get together. And we're going to spend a week discussing why it is that liberalism isn't working. Now mind you, this is 1938, right? Nazi Germany is in full swing, fascism in Italy and Spain, the welfare state certainly growing rapidly in the US, in France, in Britain, communism on the march in the Soviet Union. This is a world that's getting increasingly nasty in a variety of ways. And these folks are invited, all together about 25 or 30 people, and they spend an extremely interesting week together. And what do? Well, they conclude, first of all, that classical liberalism was a failure, that the tyrannies in Germany and Russia and the rapidly growing state in the UK and France and the United States demonstrate the failure. By the way, just a footnote here, the proceedings of this colloquium, there are 2 copies in the United States. This is about as obscure a book as you can get. It took me quite a while to get a copy to read. And they conclude that laissez-faire is inadequate. We can't just simply let the market do its thing. What we need is a new liberalism. And they talk for some time about what to call this. And Rougier finally says, you know, why don't we call it neoliberalism? And everybody says, yeah, that's not a bad idea. Let's do that. So the idea here then was that the state would be at the service of the market. And that the result, according to them, would be greater individual liberty. Well, obviously the war intervened, and what Rougier had as a project never came to pass because all of those people who attended that conference were scattered around the world, and Rougier himself wound up at Columbia, where for some bizarre reason he decided he wanted to make some kind of peace with the Pétain government in France, which basically made him persona non grata to virtually everyone in France as well as in the United States for quite a while. I have no idea why he did that. But after the war, Hayek, one of the people who participated in that original meeting, and Milton Friedman, among others, got involved in the creation of this thing called the Mont Pelerin Society. You can look it up on the web if you want to see its current form. And they met in this Swiss village. In this case, it was clearly the case where Mohammed had to go to the mountain. They concluded that all knowledge was partial, that planning was impossible, state planning, and that markets were kind of spontaneous order, to use Hayek's term, that permit coordination with imperfect information. Hence, for Hayek, for Friedman, and others in this group, markets maximize individual freedom. And actual markets are approximations to the mathematical models of the market. A very, very interesting point which comes out of von Mises' work. Von Mises was Hayek's mentor, who argued that you shouldn't worry about empirical data, worry only about whether the math fits. If the math fits, then it's a matter of getting reality to agree with the math. And I'll come back to that because that's not a trivial point. Now, I want to emphasize here that even while I'm obviously a critic of these folks, I think they made some extremely important points that at the time were completely ignored. One was this notion of the partiality of knowledge, which is now today common sense. Most of us accept that, but it wasn't in the early 1940s. It was actually quite a radical shift. And the other is that this creates enormous problems for any kind of planning, to be agreed. So classical liberalism for these folks was to be turned upside down, as the state was to be turned into a promoter of markets. Competition was enthroned as an undiluted good to be applied to all institutions. Those of us, for example, in universities have very quickly discovered over the last 25 or 30 years that our departments, our universities, our faculty members, our students are all to be ranked in a grand global competition. The most recent version of this was the recently released National Academy of Sciences report, which is truly one of the most fascinating documents to be produced in a long time. Data from 2006 finally released 4 years after the fact in 2010, so the data is already 4 years out of date, about people who have already left the university and with methodological problems of absolutely astronomical proportions, but nevertheless enough to keep a small army of administrators busy trying to decipher it. It reminds me sort of fortune tellers trying to decipher a Ouija board. So this has left us, this whole string of things, from Alberti to the present, has left us with this rather odd division of knowledge. I would say odd, although many people would find themselves very comfortable here. Okay? Basically, what we have is we have affective knowledge off here in the corner. That is, anything having to do with one's emotion is this sort of undifferentiated, we can't make sense out of that, push that off to the side. Divided, so we have the first division is between affective and rational. We have a second division of knowledge that divides nature and culture, natural knowledge and cultural knowledge. Those are supposed to have nothing much to do with each other. We have a third division that says, well, this stuff is basic knowledge, this stuff is applied knowledge, and what we're going to do is we're going to keep those as much as possible separated. And then we have a really curious distinction between sociology, that's the study of us, and anthropology, which is the study of them. And my apologies to any anthropologists in the audience. I didn't invent this. But the point is, of course, that if you think about it, there's absolutely no logical reason why we should have separate disciplines for the study of us and them. And by the way, I should note, sociologists traditionally have been quite quantitative in their study of urban people, and anthropologists quite qualitative in their study of rural people, right? Because anthropologists were supposedly interested in these small societies. The word used to be primitive. That's considered a bit passé today. But small societies, and sociologists were concerned about us urbane, sophisticated types. And then you have a few things that sort of didn't quite fit. Environmental science and education, which are relatively recent additions, and we could probably add a few others if you'd like to embellish this division of knowledge. Well, this leaves a whole series of unanswered questions. First of all, why in the world do we separate the affective from the rational if we care about the world? Most of us care about the world. And that, of course, includes people in technical fields. People I know who do things like nuclear physics or molecular biology really care about those things. In fact, they get into raging debates with each other about those things. Well, why do that if you didn't care about it? Why divide the social from the natural if all fields of knowledge have to interpret the world? We do the interpreting. The world doesn't interpret itself. And why have a separate field of the study of us and another for the study of them? Well, of course, over the last decade or two, things have started to fall apart. And some of you will note that I borrowed that from somebody a long time ago. And so I'll go through this very, very quickly. A whole series of crises. You know all of these, and so I'm not going to spend any time on them. But we know that 1/4 of the world's population is undernourished. We know there's not enough non-renewable fossil energy to go around, maintain productivity in the way we currently do it. We know that we're going to run out of phosphate fairly soon, and that the use efficiency of phosphate is appallingly low. In fact, it's low enough that phosphate is a pollutant in many places. We know that obesity is a growing problem on a global scale, despite, even in poor nations, despite food shortages. We have all kinds of agro-environmental problems, from nitrate runoff to soil erosion, depletion, to reduced biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth. There's a growing literature on climate change and how, as you heard in the last presentation, how this is likely to shift both the conditions and the locations of production. The terms of trade to poor nations continue to decline. The financial system remains incredibly unstable despite some attempts to shore it up. And the most serious attempts to shore it up were pushed back by the banks pretty successfully. So we're not in the best of circumstances. And of course, universities have not been immune to all of this. Public universities, of course, have seen major declines in funding. And while I think there are a few administrators out there who are still waiting the halcyon days that are going to appear magically on the scene, I think this is a huge mistake. The arts and humanities are under attack. You may have heard recently that SUNY Albany is talking about shutting down its Romance language department, which I find truly astounding in a large institution like that. There are ever more demands for accountability, for research. I was at a meeting just this past summer in Sweden. We were talking about a journal that I've been involved with peripherally, and the fact is the journal has not been getting enough high-quality submissions, and one person in the audience raised his hand. He said, "It doesn't make any difference what you do. I will never submit an article to that journal." And I said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Because it's not listed in the Science Citation Index, so therefore I can't get credit when I get promoted. It won't count to write a journal article for that journal. Because only articles that are published and listed in the Science Citation Index are to be counted." Citation counts. I was at another university, I won't name which one, on a review panel where the administration had come up with the wacky conclusion that the solution to the university's problems was a matter of increasing the citation counts, reducing the number of books published or publications that were in non-English languages, and focusing everything on publishing articles in English language journals so as to boost their citation counts. And I said, we on the review committee said, this is a recipe for producing a third-rate institution. The faculty cheered and the administration was appalled at what we had to say. Much more in, of course, lots of talk about increased concerns about how much money have you brought in. As some of you may know, I have spent a lot of time telling people that I think it's a really bad idea to rate people based on how much money they brought in. And I think I brought in enough that I can get away with doing that, whereas some others might not. Teaching, you know, incessant discussion about student evaluations, discussion, and there's some fascinating contradictions here, right? We're supposed to reduce the number of dropouts, but at the same time, we're supposed to have rising evaluations all the time. Well, you can do that. The problem, of course, is you're probably also going to really dilute the quality of your education. And then a whole series of impact measures having to do with outreach that are of, shall we say, dubious quality. The bottom line on this, I think, and there is a bottom line, is that university education and research is being redefined as an individual benefit instead of as a public good. I would argue to the detriment of all of us. A most recent example, which just was put on my desk a couple of days ago, and I thought I'd bring it along. Some of you may have heard. Some clever administrator at Texas A&M decided to rank all of the individual faculty members on campus in a cost-benefit analysis. They calculated how much money each person brought in through grants, through tuition, various other kinds of things, and then what that person's salary was and their lab costs and any other costs they might have. And they ranked every single person on the A&M campus based on the costs and benefits. Needless to say, the faculty haven't been terribly happy about this, and it's not exactly clear what you do about this once you know it. There are some surprises, by the way. History ranks really well. The history department, of course, has lots of students, doesn't cost much to teach history. Most historians I know don't need a wet lab, for example. Okay, you get the idea. So the implications of all of this. First of all, no single metric's going to capture these crises. No simple solutions. These are impossible to optimize, impossible to solve, and the metrics are often incommensurable. Excuse me. So if you wish, and we both took independently, picked the same, excuse me. They're wicked problems. They require both normative and positive knowledge to solve them. and they require us learning to live with complexity and uncertainty in ways that we maybe haven't been able to do in the past. So if you wish, what I want to suggest is that what we're seeing here is a kind of implosion of a whole set of antinomies. And I list some of them here: nature, culture, individual, society, subject, object, arts, sciences, participant, and observer. All of these things are imploding in on each other and leaving us with a very, very difficult to understand situation. But it turns out that there are actually many, many ways of knowing. And I list a few of them here. On the left, sort of, shall we say, loosely disciplinary ways of knowing. On the right, sort of different ways that someone might wish to know. I don't by any chance argue, I would not want to argue that this is a complete list or that there are no overlaps in the list. I leave that to you to decide. But I think the key here is that no one way of knowing is appropriate in all situations. But we have tended to focus on a very, very narrow range of ways of knowing on the assumption, following Alberti, that this is the only way that we can know. And I'll give you an example. Take that of molecular biology. In order to do molecular biology today, we need a theoretical frame, if you wish, the central dogma of DNA. We need a whole pile of equipment: chromatographs, spectrometers, gene guns, not to mention glassware and gas and sinks and oxygen and all the various other kinds of materials you need to have such a lab. You probably need some links to venture capital firms if you want to actually get anywhere with the stuff. You have to have some new intellectual property rights if you're going to claim any of that. And of course, that means that you have to have instrument companies that make all this stuff. You have to have journals that will publish the materials, and that means journal editors and peer reviewers and all the rest of that. You obviously have to have trained biologists, and you even have to have some artists who can draw pretty pictures of what DNA might look like. Okay? So the idea that to do molecular biology is to coop yourself up in a lab, shut the door, and somehow be protected from all the rest of the world is a fiction. It might be a convenient fiction, but it's a fiction. Even a field that's as sophisticated, as technically complex as molecular biology requires all sorts of social ties to various other kinds of persons and institutions, and it requires a continuous flow of things in and out of the lab. So how might one put a dialogue together? It seems to me that science is fundamentally about imagining and building alternative societal futures. John Dewey once suggested that publics arise when issues exist. It's not a matter of some undifferentiated public out there. It's that when an issue arises, a public is formed. And of course, what that means is that someone's desired future might be someone else's undesired future. That's what creates a concern. If everybody agrees, we don't need a public. It just sort of floats out there, seemingly effortlessly diffusing across the landscape. It's when there's an objection that publics arise. Moreover, it's important to remember that experiments are only complete when technologies are widely used. We've been operating for the last 300 years under the mistaken notion that experiments take place in laboratories. Anybody who's had a recalled automobile knows that experiments take place not just in laboratories, but take place throughout the life course of those products. And in fact, the people who seem to be most aware of this, interestingly enough, are people in the computer science area. There's some wonderful articles written on the impossibility of producing a secure computer program. Because it turns out that you can only have a secure program to the extent that you can limit the environment within which that program operates, in some very fixed way. The moment that you connect computers together so that programs that previously didn't interact with each other, more experimentation goes on. And the possibility of programs breaking down or not giving the results they're expected to give increases markedly. And this is something I think needs to be understood across fields of scholarship. I would also suggest that we probably need to do something which I've called the humility principle. That is to say, the moment that we get rid of the idea that science can claim absolute authority, we undermine credibility by doing so. And we've now managed to drop the first without dropping the second. Much of what is contemporary science is absolutely wrong. The problem is we don't know which part. Now, if you don't believe me, here's what I suggest you do. Pick up a 10 or 20-year-old textbook in any field and read through it, a field obviously that you know about, read through it, and you will discover it is replete with errors. It will proudly state that x equals y, despite the fact that we now know that x equals z, or maybe it equals y plus 2. But the point is that in any given field, much of what we think we know is wrong. Moreover, any given science can at best only contribute to improving situations, even as it might solve individual problems. And finally, what that means is that improvement is a moving target. And I tried to get that to stop, and it refuses. It just bounces around. Anyway, okay. So, what are the implications? Different issues create different publics, and involving publics means taking publics' concerns seriously. It also means confronting power differentials. It's all too easy for us to say, you know, we are the academics, we are the experts, we know precisely what you need to do, and if you would just simply follow the directions, everything would be fine. Well, it turns out it doesn't always work that way. This means democratizing the directions of research, developing means to foresee conflict, something which we really haven't spent too much time thinking about, and it also means building compromises without being compromised. A very important and difficult point to make. But I would suggest that the failure to engage publics, if nothing else, will lead to the further erosion of scientific authority. So I want to conclude then in the next couple of minutes with some concepts for a sustainable future. The received view of cognition is that cognition is what goes on in here, or if you wish, in here. Some people would argue it doesn't go on in here, it might go on. Anyway, but rather that cognition is something which is in fact distributed. Cognition goes on out here. Now, if you don't believe me on this, let me suggest the following. Think of the small but rather appalling literature on feral children. Children that are raised without benefit of interaction with other human beings, it turns out, don't grow up to be human beings. They grow up to be some very strange creatures that often don't even know how to stand. Okay? It's the socialization process as children that allows us to say that we understand anything. Most obviously, speaking a language requires that you interact with others. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I know that an awful lot of my thoughts are in linguistic form. And I didn't choose that language, by the way. You know, as a child, I didn't say, you know, I really like English. I think that'd be a good language to grow up learning. No, it was chosen for me by others. So cognition is distributed. Second point, co-production. The received view is that for any given situation we find ourselves in, there's a part of that situation that comes from the natural world and a part of that situation that comes from the social world or the cultural world. And that the two parts somehow create the situation. Okay? So the argument well, you know, clearly the tables and chairs and the carpet, these things are productions of the cultural world, and the natural world, well, the air that's in the room here and things like that. But another way of thinking about this, which I think is quite useful, is that nature and culture are outcomes of situations. What we decide we want to call nature, what we decide we want to call culture, are the result of disputes, of debates, of discussions, of deliberations. And that while each of us, of course, is socialized into a world in which these distinctions already exist, we're constantly tinkering with these at the edges. We're constantly saying, well, you know, actually, that table is a physical object. It's made out of metal and wood and various other kinds of things. It's just physical objects. Well, and somebody else saying, no, no, the fact that it's round as opposed to square has enormous cultural implications. You can also see this co-production in terms of how we decide what constitutes individuals and what constitutes communities. I would argue at the extremes, we have the kind of isolated individuals in this Seurat painting Sunday on the Ile de Jatte, in which no one talks to each other. They've been individualized to such an extent as to be completely outside of the realm of communication. And conversely, at the other extreme, we have the kind of mass movement that you see in the streets of North Korea, in which you have a kind of fabricated community in which everybody is supposed to march precisely the same way as everybody else. And somewhere in between are all the other possibilities that one might have. But the point is that how individual we are, how social we are, these are things that are fundamentally the outcome of processes rather than the inputs into processes. And finally, I want to talk about performativity. And this, I think, is the most useful concept, one that you might want to think about. There are at least five different places where this notion comes into play. Shakespeare, of course, said all the world's a stage, and the people merely players. So Shakespeare uses the metaphor, but he doesn't use it literally. He says, well, they're merely players. It's as if that was the case. But what if, in fact, we're all players all the time? The philosopher Austin suggested that speech acts are things that are performed. When you have a wedding, and the bride or the groom says, I do, they perform the relationship by their utterances. And we perform all kinds of relationships by utterances all the time. It's a very common way in which we interact with each other. All right, so many, many things that we do are a matter of the utterances that we make. If you don't believe me, just go on a crowded bus and yell some nasty curse word to a few of the passengers. And I should say someone who's small on a crowded bus to do that. Okay. Second, Butler in her articles talks about gender as a performance. She harkens back to Simone de Beauvoir's notion that women aren't born, women are made, women are produced by society, and she says gender is a performance. You learn to be gendered. You learn that if you're male, you're supposed to have certain kinds of gestures, and if you're female, other kinds of gestures. That if you're male, you're supposed to wear certain kinds of clothes, and female, you're supposed to wear other kinds of clothes. And, as she points out, there are sanctions. There are severe sanctions for not doing. So if right now, in the middle of this talk, I were to run over and madly kiss John Stone on the mouth, many of you would be absolutely horrified, not least John. Okay? But the point is that there are certain kinds of cues, sometimes subtle and sometimes really quite nasty, that are given that gender is to be performed in some ways and not others. Huizinga, the Dutch historian, talks about culture as play. And he says, look, he says, you know, you watch kids playing, and kids play, and they play, you know, they even play the role of animals, right? And of course, it's just play. He says, but wait a minute, wait a minute. An awful lot of what goes on in culture is play. The military have their war games. War is carried on in theaters. These are not just accidental metaphors. These are real metaphors. These are metaphors that are used in everyday life. When a group of directors at a company get together and have a strategy session, what are they doing? They are saying, this is the way we're going to perform the operations of this company over the next 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, whatever. And finally, Michel Calon, the French sociologist, talks about economics as a performative science. He says there's a very peculiar thing about economics. On the one hand, economics is about describing the way the world is put together, but economics is also a set of prescriptions. It's a set of prescriptions that say, if you organize the world in this particular way, these kinds of outcomes will occur, and if you organize it in this other way, a different set of outcomes will occur. So Calon argues economics is performative in that sense. Now, what I want to suggest here is that much of what we do, much of what we know, much of what we believe is the result of performances. Individuals' performances, but also the performances of all kinds of institutions, the performances of things. For example, in giving this presentation, I had to assume that the electricity was going to stay on and perform the role that it was supposed to perform, and that the people who are running the electrical plant wouldn't decide to walk off the job and shut it down while I was doing that. So performances, if you wish, are simultaneously constructed and real. They're constructed in the sense that this table is constructed, or the building we're in is constructed, and they're just as real as the building or the table. And that allows us to pose a new set of questions. What kinds of performances do we want to have? What kind of audience? Who's the audience for these performances? What kind of props are necessary for that particular kind of performance? What kind of backdrop should we have? What alternative ways might there be to do the performing? So to conclude, I want to suggest that we maybe need a new kind of meta-discipline, and I use that term simply because I can't think of another term to stick in there. And I call it, again, for lack of better terms, infrastructural studies. And that is, I think we need a kind of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, pluridisciplinary discipline that grapples with those things that are taken for granted, but that make society possible. And this includes things like laws, standards, regulations. For example, I don't imagine a single one of you, when you came in the room today, checked your chair out to make sure that when you sat on it didn't collapse. Did anybody do that before they sat down? One person. Jeff, I expected you to do that. No, the point, of course, is that all these chairs are manufactured to a standard. They're of standard height. They're not particularly high, they're not particularly low, although, of course, if you're very short, they might be uncomfortable, and if you're very tall, they might be uncomfortable. But we know what to expect because of those standards. Design. Various kinds of things are designed in particular ways. We see design as if it was almost a kind of add-on. But in fact, design is extremely important. I noticed during the break that not a single person tried to go out through the wall. Nor did anyone try to go out through the window. Because of the design that was built into the building that forced you to behave in certain ways. So if you want a lot of freedom, get your sledgehammer out. Categories. The categories that we use to define experience are not mere tools. They also define that experience. So another angle that this meta-discipline might talk about the equipment that makes actions possible is very, very important. You've probably all heard Stephen Hawking's, but of course you wouldn't hear Stephen Hawking's were it not for a lot of technology that makes Stephen Hawking's hearable. Okay? He needs that equipment in ways that I don't. Although I must say that this piece of equipment doesn't hurt. And finally, this metadiscipline might include self-formation. That is to say, how we make, collectively, how we make ourselves. Because I want to suggest that the self is not something which is given. The self is an outcome of a very complex and poorly understood set of processes. But it's clearly an outcome. And moreover, the self that I display to this audience is not the one that I display to my wife, which is not the one that I display to my children. And part of knowing is knowing which self to display under which circumstances. So what I'm trying to say here is we need to get, if we're going to deal with these wicked problems, we need to start thinking about the infrastructure that limits as well as produces opportunities for thinking about and acting in different ways. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.